an original MCM production.
Now, about our program. Today, as you may recall, we had planned a joint program with the Press Club with 3 reporters to interview County Executive Chris Abele. Unfortunately, about 9 o'clock last night, we discovered that Chris was ill and unable to attend our lunch program. I have to say, through some tremendous efforts, we have a great program for you today that we could just say this is the program and because it's so good. Anyway, so thanks to the efforts of fellow Rotarians, Dave Haynes, editorial page editor of the Journal Sentinel, we have a completely different program to offer. We have Dave and his colleagues Dan Bice and Mary Spikuza will be having a conversation on politics primarily from a state and local level, followed by Q&A from the floor. So for those of you who had questions for Chris, you can ask them and see what answers you get. So now, turn it over. Dave, you're on.
Thanks. I'm Dave Haynes. I'm the opinions editor at the Milwaukee Journal Sentinel, and I'm also a Rotary member, so we were glad to be asked to help out today. Dan Bice has been with our newspaper for 23 years. He's been a columnist in one form or another since 1998, and for the last 10 years, he's written his No Quarter column, which writes about politics and other goings-on in the city. It's an investigative column. Mary Spikuza has been with the newspaper for just over a year, or almost approaching a year, I guess, just over a year. Mary's a Milwaukee native and came back to town after working for about 6 years at the Wisconsin State Journal, covering the state capitol and the legislature. And we're really glad to have her. She's got a really keen political mind, and both of these individuals are regulars on our regular Thursday live program that we do at JS Online, so check it out sometime, called JS on Politics. That's every Thursday at noon. And so with that, let's get going. I thought we'd talk about the political races that are ongoing locally and statewide, and then touch a bit on the presidential race toward the end if we have time. I don't think there's any doubt that that circus is coming to town now. In fact, John Kasich's in town tomorrow. We may get a chance to see him. We're trying to get all the presidential candidates in for editorial board interviews, so we'll see.
Ted Cruz is in.
Ted Cruz is in town talking to Charlie Sykes tomorrow afternoon. I think that's out in Waukesha at the Inside that he does a couple of times a year. But let's start first with the local races. We've got a mayoral race with Alderman Bob Donovan running against the incumbent Mayor Tom Barrett. We've got a really hot race for county executive. We were to hear from Chris Abele today. We'll hear from Chris Larson next week. That race is surprisingly close, I think, at least from my perspective at this point, from everything we can tell. And then we want to talk a bit about the state Supreme Court race, another one that, at least at this point, I think is pretty close and tough to tell where that's headed. Let's start first with the mayoral race, though. Dan, let me go to you. Back during the primary, I was surprised a bit, and maybe that's my naivete, but the mayor did not get 50% of the vote.
Put the mic closer to you.
Okay, sorry. But the mayor did not end up getting 50% of the vote. I thought he would do that and more in the primary. I wonder if his campaign had any concerns coming out of the primary as a result of that.
Sure, I'll get to that in a second. It's sort of appropriate that
Dan's like a politician. He doesn't answer your question.
I know what my answer is. You can ask whatever you want. Back in 2011, I wrote a lot of stuff about Chris Abele, a lot of stuff about his OWIs, about tax liens, about a firecracker incident with Mike Hupy. But Chris was relatively new on the political scene, And people kept on mixing us up in terms of appearance. I had a goatee then, he had one, we both had bad hair. I was a little taller and weighed a little more, but still it kept on happening. And I was at the Register of Deeds office trying to find a lien for him, and the people there were so incredibly nice to me, and I could not figure out why, because that's not usually the case. And so when I got it, they said you don't have to pay anything, and I was like, really? I don't have to pay anything? And they said, oh, you're just checking up on yourself, I guess. And I was like, I'm not going to be your county exec. I'm sorry. So to your question, which I will answer, I think the mayor's people were a little surprised. I think in the week before the vote came out, they had certain people going out, running around saying, don't be surprised if it's less than 50%, which is the first indication that they were surprised. They were expecting it to be there. I don't think they were happy that it was less than 50%, because that means, in their case, 54% of the voters came and voted for someone other than the mayor, and that's not a good thing. In fact, Chris Abley was in the same boat, and Rebecca Bradley was in the same boat too. So I don't think any of those individuals were happy to be below that point. But it still, he won by 13 percentage points, and I had to put together a list of winners and losers after the race. And I had a hard time figuring out what to do with the mayor, because he did win by 13 percentage points, but he also ended up, after 12 years in office, with 46% of the vote in a primary against what I consider to be two weak challengers. So I think things have changed significantly since then, but I think they weren't happy. They weren't panicked at all, but I think they would have been much happier. And the mayor told me that he would have been happier if he had gotten over 50%.
Yeah. Hey, Mary, let me go to you. What are the issues that Bob Donovan has focused on so far in the campaign?
He's been talking a lot about crime and public safety. Oh, what, closer? Can you hear me? Okay. Can you hear me now? He's been talking a lot about crime and public safety. Obviously, Milwaukee had a spike in homicides last year. We still need to wait and see if that continues into this year, but he's been talking about that. He's been talking about car thefts and also carjackings. We've also had deaths from, people in stolen cars crashing into other cars, or killing themselves, killing others. So he's talked a lot about that. He's also really criticized the mayor, not for downtown development, but saying that development hasn't benefited the neighborhoods, and that the mayor's been so focused on downtown and the streetcar that he hasn't done enough to spread the wealth to the neighborhoods.
And speaking of the streetcar, Donovan's been very critical of what he calls the $1 billion streetcar. Talk a bit about that, and the mayor's response to that.
Right. So the streetcar right now is on a pretty limited path, but the idea is that it would obviously expand. And there have been people who want it to go to, the airport, people who want it to go to the stadium. And I think that critics feel like it's kind of a streetcar to nowhere. It'll be interesting to see once they break ground and start using it, how much, the critics will say nobody's going to be on it. It's going to be an empty streetcar. Supporters say it's going to be great. People are going to be using it to get around. They're saying that millennials will be using it to get to work. So I think we'll have to kind of wait and see on that one, but it's obviously an issue that they do not see eye to eye on.
You should point out that Bob Donovan's not been making these criticisms to us so much.
Not so much to us, no. And, and obviously Dan asked about the streetcar in an interview with the mayor, and he did say, could this cost $1 billion at a certain point, and the mayor didn't put a price cap on it. Of course, I think the idea is that it would be expanding as people are using it, not expanding if people aren't using it, but...
And to that extent, the mayor's been open about that he sees it as, in the past he said, he sees that as sort of a starter system. You have to start somewhere. Whether you agree with that approach or not, I think he has said that. So it would be hard to know what the price tag is, I suppose. Let's just, while we're on Bob Donovan for a minute, we had what I consider a very unusual experience with the alderman last week. We, as a matter of course, invite in all the candidates to come talk to the editorial board. I mentioned we're trying to get some of the presidential candidates in. A few years ago, we decided that we would not do political endorsements as a matter of course any longer. And I won't go into all the reasoning behind that, but that was a policy decision we made as a newspaper. It doesn't mean we don't do them. We will occasionally do them. We might do a couple this cycle. But we still have the candidates in, and those meetings are always open to news reporters as well, because often news happens in those meetings, and we've invited our news site in. News and editorial, two separate departments. We're even in a different room, so we make it an effort to make sure. Except for today, and I'm keeping them at arm's length. That's hard. But so we had Alderman Donovan in, as well as the other major candidates for these other races. Alderman Donovan came in the room, shook hands with Mary and I and the others in the room, and saw Dan Bice sitting at a chair in one of the corners and said, "I'm leaving if he's here." No, he said, "Are you going to stay here?" And Dan said, "Well, I was planning on it." And he said, "I'm leaving." And I said, "Look, we've had you in before. You know, we always have reporters in the room." He said, "Then I have to go." And at that point I had to say, "Well, then I guess you'll have to go." But I think we should talk just a bit about that, only because I think it's a mistake when a candidate does that. All we really wanted to talk to him about were some policy issues. And I do think there's a question there about whether a candidate can stand up to a reporter, and if you can't stand up to a reporter, can he stand up for the city? I think that's my own opinion, so I'm putting on my opinion hat here. But we've never had that happen. We did have Sheriff Clark at one point come in and say that he wanted to leave, but then he said, "No, I think I'm going to stay." And to his credit, he did. So at any rate, that happened last week. And then later you talked to Alderman Donovan, right?
Well, the whole thing stemmed from an interview I did with him in January, in which I decided, since he was running on this tough on crime agenda, that I should revisit some of the issues that he's had, going back to his 92 incident and this people that probably most of you know about, his 2005 indictment by the feds, and then most recently the fact that his campaign manager was convicted of 3 theft charges in 2015. So I wanted to go through each of those things individually. And we had actually a really decent conversation. We talked for 15 or 20 minutes, and then I talked to his campaign manager for another 10 minutes, and I then wrote a story about it. They were very concerned about the story, so they went on Facebook, said that we had this conversation which I spoke lewdly to him in ways that were offensive to women. I don't know why guys wouldn't have been offended if it were lewd, but and then he said that I was yelling at him and so forth. But then I wrote the story. They weren't particularly happy with it. But I actually gave them as much room as I could in the story to explain each of these things, because he's not really explained any one of those 3 things in the past. And so when he came in, he said he wouldn't talk. And I've been asked repeatedly, do you think he planned to walk out of our editorial meeting? My guess is, when there's a ton of ads on the air calling to attention your erratic behavior, it's not really a good thing to walk into a meeting, then get into an argument, and then walk out. But the funny thing was, he had an endorsement meeting he had a press meeting to announce his endorsement from Sheriff Clark, and Mary and I decided to go. And we said, "Hey, why don't we go just ask Bob a bunch of questions afterwards?" And after this incident, he didn't even bring it up, and we talked for 10 minutes.
And you had a very cordial conversation.
Mm-hmm.
So,
and we went over some stuff. I had no idea that he was pro-residency. He supports the residency requirement. He wouldn't say who he's voting for president. Says he hasn't even thought about it. Says he hasn't even thought about which primary to vote in, and says it's between him and God as to who he voted for in 2012.
It was interesting because the mayor, in some of his ads targeting Donovan, have accused him of being Milwaukee's Donald Trump. And of course, Donald Trump wouldn't do the debate with Megyn Kelly. So we were trying to figure out if that makes Bice Milwaukee's Megyn Kelly. I'm not sure.
Different
have better
hairstyle.
hair, but
Yeah, he has
both
better
have
hair.
nice hair.
So let's get back to that race. One more question, and then we'll move on to the county executive's race. What has the more recent polling shown, Dan, that you've seen?
There's no public polling that's going on, but there's a lot of private polling. I heard about one yesterday that has shown that the mayor's gained a lot of ground since the primary. The numbers were around 55-57% to 30%, and in particular, a lot of the black vote that supported Joe Davis and some of the black and female vote that had not voted in the primary are going toward Barrett. So he's, and you would expect that. He's been on the air a great deal. He starts a TV ad today. Bob Donovan starts 2 radio ads today. And I mean, obviously, it's one campaign that has $1 million in the bank, and the other one that has $40,000 in the bank, and you can tell the difference in the ads when you hear them today. Bob Donovan's ad sounds like he cooked it up in his basement last night, and the mayor's looks like it was put together by a team of consultants.
So with that segue, I want to move to the county executive's race, where we have a similar, in terms of the money at least, a David and Goliath type of story. Maybe Dan, let me have you start. Talk about the fundraising there. How much will the county executive, Chris Abley, likely spend on this race?
So I'll probably write a thing this afternoon on the ad buys by the two campaigns. Chris Abley's team has just recently bought $500,000 worth of airtime. That's not for the ads themselves, but just the airtime between now and the election. And I see that Chris Larson had just bought $2,400 worth of airtime.
Wait a minute, 2400,
right?
Correct. Okay.
2,400, and the other one's 420,000. So it's a substantial amount. And in the primary, Chris Abley spent more than $2 million. When I wrote what I thought was a reasonable guess that he would spend $5 million in the entire election, I got calls immediately telling me that I was lowballing it, and that it would be closer to $7 or $8 million. And obviously, Chris Larson doesn't have anywhere near that amount.
But yet
he was outspent. I think it was $20 to 1. The ratio was in the.
Did
primary.
you break that down by vote?
That was the most amazing thing on election night was the fact.
That's
to me, the Abley people say they weren't surprised, but I'm sure his media people weren't surprised as pollster. But still, I think when it came to it, and the fact that he finished second, was a surprise to them. And I think they still believe there's a possibility that Abley could lose.
From what I'm hearing, there's a good possibility. I want to, Mary, let me ask you, what issues stand out so far in that particular race?
So Chris Larson has been talking a lot about the domes, the MPS idea that Chris Abley would be able to, he's calling it a takeover. That's not what Chris Abley's calling it, but they're not seeing eye to eye on the domes. They clash on public schools. There's been an interesting issue over Estabrook Dam where Chris Larson, most progressives are not in favor of dams. Most progressives are not in favor of dams, and Chris Larson has not taken a stand calling for Estabrook Dam to be removed. So we just saw some ads. I think those came out last week, right? With Abley targeting Larson over that. Obviously Larson has not had as much money for ads, but Abley has been targeted by third-party groups, and we've seen ads and flyers comparing both of them, but comparing him to Scott Walker, who obviously does not have soaring approval ratings in Milwaukee. So I think both of them are trying to kind of portray the other as Scott Walker.
It's been interesting since the primary. Abley spent $2 million on a very upbeat, positive campaign, but the day after the primary, he switched and it became a very negative campaign, which is obviously generally more effective with voters. The positive campaign obviously didn't help him win, but the thing is, he's been running a negative campaign that has been placing him to the left of Chris Larson. Chris Larson, obviously a liberal Democrat who opposed Act 10, went to Illinois. No one's going to mistake him for a ally of Scott Walker unless you get the flyers. And so he's put himself to the left on banking issues, campaign donations, Estabrook Park, and I understand there'll be new ads coming out tomorrow that'll attack Larson on the tax issue. So even though Abley, I consider him more of a moderate, he's a liberal on social issues, a fiscal conservative, has decided the way to win this election is he thinks he's going to hold the suburbs, which are much more conservative. And he won 17 of the 19 suburbs, but he's decided the way to win, and it's probably not him, as his consultants believe, is to chip away at his Larson support in the city. Larson won the city 50 to 41. And so, and a poll that I just heard about yesterday, a pretty massive poll, 1,600 people were polled. Abley was a virtual tie with Larson, so it looks like the strategy so far has been effective.
So are there enough of votes in the suburbs, though, to counter Larson's advantage potentially, especially with union support in the city.
You know, with the presidential campaigns, that's a complete wild card. We have no idea right now. They're predicting an unprecedented number of people coming out to vote in the general election, more than any election since 1980.
Yeah.
And I don't think anyone has quite figured out. I've talked to two people today who give me two dramatically different ideas as to who's going to benefit from the turnout. But I think it's interesting that Abley has come out with a flyer that says Chris Larson is no Bernie Sanders, trying to break the tie between those people.
I've gotten that one at home, actually.
And probably many of you have.
It's pretty creative.
It's a little goofy. It's got a picture of Bernie Sanders' hair on Chris Larson.
Yeah.
But it's a. I don't think right now we have a very good idea as to whether the Sanders turnout's going to be enormous. If it is enormous, will that benefit Larson? Where Abley's base is in this whole thing? I don't think that's
Abley's
been
base
resolved.
is a really interesting point. Mary, jump in here too on this, because I'm not sure if Abley isn't a man without a country. He is a Democrat, self-professed Democrat, but Larson's more of a Democrat. And so I guess my question has been, in asking you about the suburban vote, is does Abley really have a base? What is his base? I'm not sure I understand it.
Not unions.
It's not unions.
Yeah, I think he's a general election Democrat. He's what many Democrats would like to see running statewide in a general election. The problem for him is he's got to get through a primary, and in the primary, unions aren't going to be with him. He didn't do very well with African Americans. He didn't do very well with women. So a lot of the interest groups for the Democratic Party are not with him. But he did only lose by less than 1%, less than 0.5%. So it's even though we like to read a lot into these primaries, it's going to be a very different electorate on general election day. And if it's true that he's neck and neck with Larson in the city, he wins this race because
Right.
Larson can't win as many votes in the suburbs.
Right. Your point about the electorate is really important, and it matters for the next race we're going to talk about as well, the state Supreme Court. It all depends on who comes out to vote, and that's super dependent. The people I've talked to, and I know you have too, super dependent on what happens in the presidential campaign. If a lot of Trump supporters come out, that's a pretty different electorate than if more moderate Republicans come out or more traditional Republicans come out. Why don't we move on then to the state Supreme Court? Both candidates, Justice Rebecca Bradley and Appeals Court Judge Joan Kloppenburg, have essentially made judgment an issue in this race. And they've both said things that you would expect them to say, that we're going to be capable of independent thinking, and yet they've attacked the other as being potentially an activist judge. Mary, what do the contours of this race look like so far?
We've heard Justice Bradley talk a lot about judicial philosophy and how that's the key of the race. She's had praise for Justice Antonin Scalia, who just passed away, for Clarence Thomas. Obviously, Kloppenburg does not cite those judges as her biggest influences, and she talks about how the race is really about independence, and that she is not a partisan and wants to take partisanship out of the Supreme Court race. Obviously, Bradley and her supporters disagree and feel like she is highly partisan, but I think we're going to see a lot of Waukesha turning out to support Bradley. I think we will see Madison and Milwaukee largely turning out to support Kloppenburg. And it's obviously a really close race, and it'll be interesting to see who benefits from the presidential turnout. And
these Supreme Court races just wear me out, because it is that every time. The one side, if someone says, I'm an independent, vote for me, and don't vote for my partisan opponent. And the other opponent is always an independent who says, don't vote for my opponent because he or she is partisan. And the fact is, everybody in this room knows the Supreme Court is partisan. And I don't think it's a surprise to anybody. Right. And I don't think anyone's fooling anybody by saying I am independent. I think when they get on the court, if they would get on the court, if Rebecca Bradley gets on the court, no one is going to be stunned if she joins forces with Pat Rogansack and the conservative wing of the court. And if Joanne Kloppenburg wins, will she be voting with Justice Bradley, Justice Ann Walsh Bradley, and Abramson? Sure, they're going to. I mean, it's not going to be a surprise. It just is. I don't know. Every time I was watching the debate, and I was like, seriously, we're going to go through this again, and no one would just be honest about where they're going to be in this race.
Yeah. I think it's important to point out too that those are the tendencies, but on any given case, there are swing justices, and some of the justices do vote the other way, and both of them have given examples of that.
Yeah, I mean, Justice Prosser has been more of the group right now. He's been the one that's been more likely to swing between the two differences. I mean, between the two sides. But of these two candidates, I don't think anyone will be surprised if they're more partisan or not.
In terms of which camp they join most of the time. So back in 2011, in the wake of Act 10, when that was roiling the political waters here, Joan Kloppenburg ran against Justice Prosser and lost a close election. Actually went to a recount. We had the issue in Waukesha County, if you remember, with some votes that weren't counted and all of that. At that time, she really ran more against Governor Walker in a lot of ways than Justice Prosser. And I get the sense that she's sort of doing the same thing here.
She is. She also made a big mistake by not putting much effort into campaigning in Milwaukee, and underperformed here. And had she performed as well as some of the other candidates, some of the other liberal or Democrat candidates had, she could have won that race. But yeah, she is. Well, I mean, she's not the only one. Governor Walker, he's not on the ballot, but he's everywhere in this election. You see him in the county exec's race. You see him in the mayor's race, and you see him in the Supreme Court race, and that's because he's one of the most unpopular governors in the country right now. His numbers in Milwaukee County are his favorables are in the 20% range. So
about 39 overall statewide
right
now.
But here it's even
Lower
worse.
in Milwaukee.
Yeah, in Milwaukee, the city of Milwaukee, even worse. So if you can associate your opponent with Scott Walker, then that's a good thing. And that's why we're in a bizarre situation at the county exec's race where both of them are pointing fingers at each other and saying, look, that person's like Scott Walker, when actually, in truth, neither of them is.
So who's putting the big money into this race so far, and do we think that liberal groups might put some money in?
So far, we've seen a lot from a conservative group. It's unclear who it's funded by, but I think there are lots of theories. It's what was it, Wisconsin Alliance for Reform? Is that the group?
Yeah, that's the name of it.
They've largely been spending on the Supreme Court race, on attacking Russ Feingold, and they are kind of one of the dark money groups where they don't disclose their funders, but there are obviously a lot of dark money groups around.
What you just wrote a lot about dark money groups. So, but I think people have a pretty good guess as to who is running, the actual person running Wisconsin Alliance for Reform, and that's by putting together who they've attacked so far. They've gone after Joan Kloppenburg, they've gone after Russ Feingold, no surprise there, but they've also gone after one particular DA who signed off on the John Doe investigation. So it's obviously someone who was tied or involved in that, or someone with money who's put money in, who's is suggesting and encouraging them to do ads in that direction. And so many people think R.J. Johnson, Scott Walker's main strategist, is somehow involved in this group. I brought Scott Walker in again.
There you go. So are we likely to see any liberal groups lining up behind Kloppenburg in the same way?
I haven't seen it so far. It wouldn't surprise me, but right now, Kloppenburg's been benefiting from the free media coverage, the regular press coverage of Rebecca Bradley's writings from when she was young, and other stories about her history. So, it's been a battle between the paid media and the free media in this race so far.
Well, I wonder if the sort of political demise of We Act, the state teachers union, has anything to do in a race like that. They used to jump in.
They did. In fact, I can remember going back a long time ago when Justice Ann Walsh Bradley ran the WEAC put in $700,000 into the race, which was big money then, and helped push her over the top. And I remember trying to get her to respond to find out whether she would vote in the school choice case that was going to be coming before the court. The funny thing was she recused herself because of the donation, and as a result, WEAC ended up with nothing. At this time, I haven't seen. Have you, Mary, anybody who's tried to capitalize on the coverage about the Rebecca Bradley's?
Not yet, no.
Any polling on that race?
I've just heard polling in the Milwaukee County area that Kloppenburg's up about 20 points here, but you would expect something like that.
Right. Well, let's move on and spend just a couple of minutes on the presidential race.
I do want to say one more
sure.
thing. Unlike the mayor's race, where there were three candidates, well, actually four, but three candidates essentially, Joe Davis ends up dropping out, and almost all of his support, it appears, has gone to Mayor Barrett, or most of it. In this case, everyone's expecting in the Supreme Court race that Joe Donald, who finished third, that his support will go to Kloppenburg. But again, it's not usually that easy. And secondly, there are going to be a lot of voters who come in and vote in the presidential primary who didn't vote in the primary.
Right. Well, let's set up the presidential race then. As I said earlier, the circus is coming to town. There are 3 caucuses this Saturday, and then between Saturday and April 5th, about 10 days, there's nothing. And we're the only game in town on April 5th. Only election that day. So Wisconsin is a prize in presidential politics, an industrial upper Midwest state. And we can expect to see, I think, a lot of candidates and a lot of ads, so use your TiVo, over the next couple of weeks.
Do you do
You
that?
don't
I don't.
You don't want to
Actually,
miss one, do you?
Yeah,
I love those ads.
I do.
Of course you do.
I do.
I don't watch a lot of TV, so I need something that just captures the ads for me.
Okay. But as I said, we have John Kasich in tomorrow, Ted Cruz in tomorrow.
What I love about the presidential race is a lot of Republicans are hoping that Republican establishment are hoping that Wisconsin sorts this out, that finally that someone other than Donald Trump will win, and this will serve as a firewall for the establishment and so forth. And I'm like, this is Wisconsin, okay? We do like recall elections. We're crazy. We vote in everything. We're expecting 60% of the people to come out and vote in April for a race. They're expecting Wisconsin to solve this thing. I mean, but God bless them.
It's kind of like Obi-Wan Kenobi. It's the only hope at this point. So.
Yeah.
But I do think that a lot of people are aligning with Ted Cruz. You saw a Right Wisconsin column about how calling on Scott Walker to endorse Ted Cruz. I think a lot of people are feeling like if it's going to not be Trump, it has to be Ted Cruz, and it has to start with Wisconsin. And really, if Trump wins Wisconsin, what hope?
But the governor's really sat this out so far.
He has, and he said even yesterday that he wasn't sure whether he would be endorsing before the.
And we can ask him again at 2:00 today.
And we'll ask him at 2:20.
Well, the New York Times had a story on Sunday which made the point that Mary's making, that the Stop Trump movement has said that Wisconsin is where we have to begin. And so I think you're going to see, again, you'll see a lot of ads, and you'll see a lot of anti-Trump material between now and then.
The hard thing is, the polling has shown Trump has run first or second from the very beginning in Wisconsin. Yeah. But when you try to figure out who's running the Trump campaign in Wisconsin, you can't really figure it out because there's nobody from the establishment who's on his side. It's just it's a crazy thing.
Well, Craig Gilbert had this interesting story in the Sunday paper that you may have seen, which looked at Trump's support. It's very bifurcated. He does not have much support in the core industrial region here around Milwaukee, but outstate, he does really well. And that's mirrored in other states, I think, as well. So the interesting thing to me is, where do those Rubio voters go? Maybe they're going to Cruz, but maybe not.
And I don't think that the strategy of pointing out that Donald Trump is not a real conservative is very effective. We haven't seen that works anywhere else, and I think it's been a misreading of the Trump supporters. The Trump supporters are largely interested and attracted to a personality and an attitude. the way certain things are said, the way Trump responds to the establishment, the way he responds to people in the head of the party, the fact that he's paying for his own campaign, those things I think are the things that are attractive to people. Saying that he's had two different positions on abortion, I don't think that really matters to many of his supporters.
The thing I heard over and over when I was in Iowa prior to the Iowa caucuses, I heard three words, and I heard it from at least a dozen people: shake it up, and those from Trump supporters. And so I agree with Dan. I think it's not based on ideology. And I think that's really confusing the establishment figures and the movement conservatives in the Republican Party.
And it's interesting because Paul Ryan keeps saying, like, I don't want to get involved in the race. I don't want to comment on the race. And then he's constantly pulled in to talk about Donald Trump's comments about Muslims, or Donald Trump's comments about violence, or Donald Trump's comments about, and you can just see he's like, okay, I'm going to comment again, but I really want to stay out of it. And it's putting him in an interesting position as a speaker.
You know he doesn't like Donald Trump. I mean,
well, yes. I mean, it hasn't like he's been jumping in to praise him exactly.
It's like Debbie Wasserman Schultz when she's been saying this week, I'm not supporting Hillary Clinton. Everybody knows she's supporting Hillary Clinton. You don't put the debates on a Saturday night in late December.
Opposite the last episode of Downton Abbey.
if you're a Bernie Sanders fan. So, I mean, obviously he says that. And he even organized a group that got together in Florida about a month ago to figure out a way to stop the Trump movement. Obviously that wasn't effective, but he's not a fan.
And I think Paul Ryan's in a tough position. He has to try to remain neutral. Donald Trump may be the standard bearer of the party that he's involved with, and so it's a tough position, I think. Go ahead.
One interesting thing to watch for in the news in the next 24 hours is Donald Trump has said he's going to put out his list of 7 to 10 Supreme Court candidates that he would be in favor of putting on the court if it were up to him. There's going to be one name that'll be of interest to
Dianne
people.
Sykes?
Yeah. So it'll be interesting to see how that plays out if he puts Dianne Sykes on the list, and if he does, you might listen to the radio tomorrow morning just to see how that plays in the area.
Well, let's leave it there and take some questions. Yes, sir. So the question is, 2 contested circuit court races on the ballot in Milwaukee County. How does a responsible voter figure out who to vote for?
Do people asking questions have to disclose their biases or affiliations?
That was Chef Fleming, by the way.
I just was wondering if the rules applied all the way around. So, to tell you the truth,
That's a good question.
I don't vote in any races I write about, so I don't really even think about that. I try not to have the mindset of telling people how to vote one way or the other, even though I write stuff that sort of tells you. I write critical stuff. My focus is always on, is this a good story or not a good story? There are people in the newsroom who really hate it that I don't vote in local races, that I don't vote even in national races if I write about them. So, but my guess is one way you can tell is by endorsements. In most races, endorsements don't matter very much, but I think in the circuit court races, endorsements do matter. And then secondly, fewer of these are open seats. Many people have been appointed or selected to the position, and I think who's behind the person or who helped put them in their position, that's a valid way to determine whether you should support somebody or not.
Yes. Question is, did any of us write for a student newspaper when we were in college? I did. I'll take a whack at that. I think I worked at, I went to Indiana University, worked on the Indiana Daily Student, was editor my last semester there. And, look, we made some mistakes as student journalists. And we probably said things in the locker room at the rec center that I wouldn't want anyone to know I said. But one of the differences is that, to me, was that you had to think about it when you write it down. And you had to have an editor to look at it before it went in print. They didn't catch everything, all the foolish mistakes, but they caught most of them. So that to me is kind of the difference. But did we do foolish things? Yeah, you bet. Jumping in Shoalwater Fountain after a night at the bars was a really dumb thing to do.
You know, I wrote for my student newspaper, and writing for a student newspaper was a formative experience for me. Yeah. I grew up in a very, very conservative, fundamentalist Christian household, and I'm not there now, but that's where I started. And writing in the student newspaper 30 years ago was something. I frequently don't know what I think about a subject until I write it out. And it forces you to think through issues. When you write something, there's the whole process of taking a topic, digesting it, and then responding to it. After this whole thing started, I went and looked up some of my writings that I had in my college newspaper. I'm pretty happy with what I wrote back then. I couldn't think of anything that would be embarrassing to me, though I'm sure there probably was maybe somewhere. But I think that was an important time to me in figuring out who I was and what I was going to do.
And I wrote I actually started out as a photographer for Shorewood for the Copperdome yearbook, and I wasn't a very good photographer, so they actually kept encouraging me to write and said, like, you're a really good writer. And I was like, what about my photos? And they were like, you're a really good writer. And so I started writing more, but I've looked through them, and probably a lot of cliches and some, poor grammar choices, but I don't think that I wrote anything super embarrassing back in high school, and I should probably go through again and see.
Yeah. Note to self.
You can go stop by Shorewood High.
Another question. Back in the corner. So the question was, big ad buys, is it more consultant driven? Does it help the candidate, or does it just help the consultant?
So I'm sure there's many consultants who want to work on the Abley campaign, just because there's a lot of money there.
Considering hanging my own shingle out of that.
But the thing is, if you don't spend it, you end up falling behind. So if everybody spends money, you don't gain much ground. But if you don't spend it, you fall behind. I think that's the Donovan situation. He's just now going on air for himself right now, and he has to catch up and make up a lot of ground. We saw that with Tommy Thompson against Tammy Baldwin. There was a 3-week window after the primary where he came off the air because he had no money. Yeah. Tammy Baldwin then redefined him, that he's not the same Tommy Thompson. The guy you voted for, great guy, but is this him? Yeah. And people bought into that. So I think the big advantage is, the reason people spend it is because they're afraid not to spend it.
On the Tammy ad, though, the difference there might be that was a brilliant ad. That really worked. I'm not sure a bad ad would have worked as well. Mary?
Bad ads generally don't work.
Bad ads generally don't work.
We can agree on that.
We can agree.
I do remember reading through some of Governor Walker's presidential campaign finance reports, and just the amount of money he was spending on consultants, ads, video,
photographers,
things like that, and thinking, gosh, who were these friends of people who were consulting
friends
for
of his
him,
campaign manager.
Friends of his campaign manager. Who was how much did he realize how much money was flowing out the door and as quickly as it was, because obviously he said he was getting out to clear a path for a positive alternative to the frontrunner Donald Trump, but you have to wonder if so much money hadn't been flooding out the door, if he would have been able to stay at
Well,
the
he's going to be kicking himself seeing John Kasich up there in the debate stage now, where he easily could have been him. Another question. Ma'am. Yes, ma'am. Good question. Really good question. The role of polling in the election, the technicalities. Should we believe anything we see in a poll?
You're right. It seems like there have been more questions in a presidential race, where polling has had a greater role than it's ever had before. But the fact is, there's no alternative to it, so people just rely on polling to such an incredible amount. In local races, it's not had the same sort of impact, but obviously it helped determine who was on the stage in the Republican debates. In terms of who's right and wrong. There've been a couple states where the polling's been dramatically off.
Yeah, Michigan with Bernie Sanders, I
Yeah,
think is the biggest one. He was down 20 points apparently in the polling the weekend before the election, and he ended up winning.
And Cruz obviously outperformed the polls in Iowa, with the late surge and stuff. But I mean, I went to grad school and worked for the National Opinion Research Center when I was in grad school. I mean, polling can be incredibly sophisticated, and it can be in general pretty reliable, but at the same time you need to know what type of poll things people are using, because different polls can result in very different types of outcomes.
Well, we have a really good poll at Marquette. Charles Franklin is one of the best in the business. But I think to your question, I've read some stories about this recently. There are some real challenges going forward. Millennials don't answer their phone. So even if you get a good mix of cell phones, which you have to do now, that's just part of the job, maybe you have to text them. I don't know. That's what I have to do with my kids. Snapchat? Maybe you have to Snapchat them. Any more questions?
There's
one
two.
way in back. Let's talk just a bit about that. The last polling I saw had Bernie Sanders up on Hillary by a bit. It was a smidge. It was very, very close. And a lot of people think that even now, though Bernie hasn't done as well in Ohio as expected, that Wisconsin's a state he can win. Dan?
The only thing is, Hillary Clinton has a large lead in delegates, and even though the polling shows that they're neck and neck nationally, the system appears to be set up with the superdelegate system so that she ends up winning. So there's less interest in that. Plus, it's much more fun talking about Donald Trump. Yeah,
Wisconsin is not winner
Yeah,
take
it's
all,
not.
which is a key point. One last question, I guess.
He has said that, he filed his report in the end of January. He was hinting well before that it wasn't going to be paid off, and it wasn't. And he said that, it could take a year to pay off that level of debt. He has been fundraising to pay it off, and it was actually Cruz was tweeting, urging his supporters to help Walker pay off his debt. So we'll have to wait and see when the next, when we get the next update, but it doesn't sound like he's paid it off.
It's going to take a while.
Yeah.
And just one last reminder, we do the JS on Politics show every Thursday at noon live, and then we archive it at our website. So if you like what we did here, you can watch it again on Thursday.
An MCM production.